It's August of 1590, and John White is walking back into a place he has spent almost 3 years dreaming about. Except the place that greets him isn't the one he left behind, because the houses are gone, and standing where his daughter's home used to be is a fence he never built, a palisade that wasn't there when he sailed for England. He moves through the enclosure, scanning for any sign of the 115 people he left in this colony, his daughter and granddaughter among them. And he finds no bodies, no ash, no wreckage of a fight, which should be a relief, except it isn't, because it means whatever happened here happened quietly enough to leave nothing behind. And then he sees it, cut deep into a post at the edge of the palisade, 8 letters, carved with care rather than panic. CROATOAN. Now here's the version of this story you've probably heard, that this single word is the whole mystery. An unexplained message left by a colony that vanished into thin air, and generations of writers have built entire theories on how strange and how sinister that one word looks. But to the man standing in front of it that morning, the word wasn't strange at all, because he and the colonists had agreed on exactly what it would mean before he ever left, which is where this case gets interesting, because the real mystery was never the word itself. It's why nobody ever went and checked. To understand why White is standing in a fenced-off ghost town in 1590, you have to go back further than 1587, because the family colony that disappeared wasn't the first group of English settlers on Roanoke Island. It was the second, and the first group had already poisoned the well for everyone who came after them. In 1585, a mostly military colony under Ralph Lane set up on the island, and relations with the neighboring communities collapsed fast, as English dependence on local food supplies bred resentment on both sides. Lane's men burned a nearby village over a suspected theft and killed the regional leader Winginer, and by the time Sir Francis Drake arrived, offering the starving colonists a ride home, they took it without hesitation. Which means when John White's group landed in July of 1587, 118 men, women and children who were never even supposed to be on Roanoke Island in the first place, since their actual destination was the Chesapeake Bay further north, they arrived into a political situation they hadn't created and didn't understand. Their own ship's pilot refused to sail them any further and dropped them at Roanoke instead. And within weeks, one of their colonists, a man named George Howe, was killed while out alone, a clear signal that whatever peace had once existed here was long gone. Faced with dwindling supplies and a colony that couldn't feed itself, the settlers made a decision that would end up defining the rest of their lives, which was to ask John White, their governor, to sail back to England for reinforcements. White didn't want to go, because it meant leaving behind his daughter, Eleanor Dare, and his granddaughter, Virginia, who had been born on the island only weeks earlier, the first English child recorded in the colonial project. But the colonists convinced him it was the only way the settlement would survive the winter, and so in August of 1587, he boarded a ship and left. Before he left, though, the settlers made him a promise, which is the detail almost every retelling of this story leaves out. They agreed that if they were forced to relocate while he was away, they would carve the name of their new destination somewhere visible. And if that relocation happened because they were under attack or in danger, they would add one more symbol above it, a cross. It was a simple contingency plan, the kind any group of practical, frightened people would put in place. And it's the single piece of evidence that turns this from an unsolvable vanishing into something closer to a paper trail. White expected to be back within months. Instead, he wouldn't set foot on Roanoke again for almost 3 years, and by the time he did, the world both he and the colonists had left behind no longer existed. White reached England in November of 1587 to find a country bracing for war, because Spain was assembling what would become the Armada, and every ship the Crown could requisition was being pulled toward national defense instead of colonial resupply. A small relief attempt did leave in 1588 2 lightly armed vessels that were supposed to slip past the conflict, but their crews got distracted trying to capture enemy ships for profit along the way, were attacked themselves, lost their supplies, and limped back to England, having accomplished nothing. For 2 more years, nobody made it back to Roanoke at all. And while White was tied up in a country at war, Something was happening on Roanoke Island that nobody at the time could have measured, but that modern science eventually would, because tree ring analysis published decades later revealed that the years 1587 to 1589 produced the most severe drought the region had experienced in roughly 800 years, which means for the entire span of White's absence, the colonists weren't just isolated, they were trying to survive in the middle of a climate catastrophe, one that would have devastated their crops and freshwater, and made the neighboring indigenous communities far less able or willing to feed over 100 extra mouths. Even the communities most willing to help may have been struggling simply to feed their own children first. So picture the imbalance. In London, the delay is measured in warships and shipping schedules. On Roanoke, it's measured in empty grain stores and a drying well, and somewhere in that gap, the 115 people White left behind made a decision to leave. When White finally returned in August of 1590, sailing into the Sound on what happened to be his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, he found the settlement exactly as we described at the top of this episode. Dismantled rather than destroyed, enclosed by a palisade nobody had built when he left, and carved with 2 messages rather than 1, the word CROATOAN cut into a post, and the shorter CRO cut into a nearby tree, and critically, nowhere near either carving was there a cross. To White, this wasn't ambiguous. It was the plan working exactly as agreed, a clear signal that the colonists had relocated toward the CROATOAN people, a community with a long-standing, comparatively friendly relationship with the English, one built through Manteo, an indigenous liaison who had traveled to England himself and remained one of the settlers' closest allies. White wasn't looking at a riddle, he was looking at an address, and by every account he intended to go there immediately. But he never made it. The weather turned violent, his ship's anchors were damaged in the storm, the waters around the coast became too dangerous to navigate, and the sailors on board, who had their own commercial priorities and were growing impatient with the delay, ultimately refused to continue the search. White was forced to turn back to England without ever laying eyes on CROATOAN, without ever confirming whether his daughter and granddaughter had made it there alive, and without ever returning to try again. He had the address. He never made the trip. History remembers Roanoke as the lost colony, but John White probably remembered it as the search he never got to finish. And that's really the emotional center of this entire case, because the story we've inherited treats Roanoke as an unsolvable mystery, when the truth is closer to an unfinished rescue. The colonists left instructions. Weather and circumstance are the only reason those instructions were never followed. The most widely accepted theory among historians is that the colonists relocated toward CROATOAN territory, generally identified with what's now Hatteras Island, and gradually assimilated into that community. It's supported by the inscription itself, by Manteo's ties to the region, and by decades of archaeological work on Hatteras that has turned up genuinely English material. Sword and firearm fragments, ceramics, navigational equipment, and something particularly intriguing, hammer scale. The tiny flakes of metal produced when someone is actively forging or repairing iron, which isn't a traditional indigenous practice and suggests Europeans were working metal on the island themselves rather than simply trading for finished goods. But this theory has a serious gap, which is that despite everything found on Hatteras, no confirmed colonial structure has ever been identified there, no building foundation, no burial, no site that can be conclusively tied to a named member of the 1587 colony. European objects can travel through trade, salvage, or contact with individual Europeans long after 1587, so intriguing artifacts aren't the same as proof of where the colonists actually lived. A second theory points inland instead. Conservators at the British Museum discovered a hidden symbol beneath a paper patch on White's own map of the region, a shape in red and blue that may represent a fort, positioned near where the Roanoke and Chowan rivers meet. Archaeologists later recovered late 16th century English ceramics at a nearby site now known simply as Site X, in present-day Bertie County, which raises the possibility that some colonists moved inland rather than toward the coast. Here too, though, the evidence stops short of proof, since no fort or English structure has actually been found at the location, and the pottery, while period accurate, could theoretically have arrived through trade rather than settlement. Which is what makes the third theory the one most historians find genuinely persuasive, that the colonists didn't move as a single group at all, but split up. 115 people, including children, would have been an enormous burden for any one community to absorb in the middle of a historic drought, so dividing into smaller groups, some heading toward CROATOAN, others moving inland, makes practical sense, and would explain why English material keeps turning up in more than one location instead of a single confirmed settlement. It's a less satisfying answer than a single dramatic ending, but it's the one that actually fits the scattered, contradictory evidence we have. 20 years later, English colonists at Jamestown would hear second-hand stories about pale-skinned people living among indigenous communities near the Chesapeake, and reports that the Powhatan leader had ordered the killing of a group associated with that region. But the accounts were inconsistent, recorded decades after the fact, and no physical evidence has ever confirmed a Roanoke settlement anywhere near Jamestown. Every promising lead in this case ends the same way, close enough to feel real, never quite close enough to prove. Somewhere on what's now Hatteras Island, or inland near the rivers where that hidden fort symbol pointed, or scattered further than either, the descendants of 115 people may have lived out full lives that were never recorded by the country that left them behind. And on a weathered post that no longer stands, in a settlement that was dismantled with care rather than destroyed in panic, 8 letters were once cut deep enough to survive 3 years of silence, waiting for a search party that turned back in a storm and never tried again. For more forgotten cases, famous mysteries, and dark history, consider subscribing. Until next time.